Right now, thousands of meters below the surface, an enormous pulse of warm water is moving eastward along the equator, invisible from above, but carrying enough heat to reshape the weather of an entire planet. Scientists have a name for it, a Kelvin wave, and where it's heading and what it's about to do when it arrives at the surface is why climate forecasters are using language this summer that most of them have never used before. In March of this year, forecasters gave a 22% chance of happening, a real possibility, but nothing alarming. Then April came, and that number jumped to 80%. And then the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts released its May update. The number that came back stopped people in their tracks. 100%. A 100% probability of a super El Niño forming by November. And the projected peak temperature of the ocean at the center of all this? 3 degrees Celsius above average. A level of heat in the Pacific that hasn't been recorded since 1877, almost 150 years ago. The forecasts are not just pointing in the same direction, they are converging, faster than the models can keep up with. And what they're converging on is something that will touch almost every region on Earth. Before we talk about what a super El Niño does, it's important to understand what El Niño actually is, because most people have heard the name without fully understanding the mechanism. Under normal conditions in the tropical Pacific, trade winds blow from east to west, pushing warm surface water toward Asia and Australia, and allowing cold, nutrient-rich water to rise up along the South American coast. That's the baseline state of the Pacific: warm water in the west, cooler water in the east. El Niño happens when those trade winds weaken. The warm water that was being pushed westward sloshes back toward the center and east of the Pacific. Sea surface temperatures rise significantly in the central and eastern tropical Pacific. And because the ocean and atmosphere are constantly exchanging heat and moisture, that shift in ocean temperature doesn't stay in the Pacific. It reorganizes weather patterns across the entire globe, changing where it rains, where it droughts, where it floods, where it burns, and ultimately pushing global average temperatures upward as the ocean releases stored heat back into the atmosphere. El Niño events happen naturally, roughly every 2 to 7 years. A weak one barely registers outside the tropics. A moderate one shifts rainfall patterns across multiple continents. A strong one reshapes the weather for an entire year or more. And a super El Niño is in a different category entirely. At that threshold, the sheer volume of heat transferred from the ocean to atmosphere is sufficient to physically displace the jet streams of both hemispheres, generating simultaneous droughts, floods, wildfires, and heat waves across countries thousands of kilometers from the Pacific. There have been only 4 confirmed super El Niño events since reliable records began in 1950. Each one left a mark. The 1997 to 1998 event triggered catastrophic wildfires across Indonesia, devastating flooding in Peru and Ecuador, and widespread coral bleaching across the Pacific. The economic damage ran into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The 2015 to 2016 event pushed 2016 to become the hottest year ever recorded at that time. These were serious, consequential events that affected hundreds of millions of people across multiple continents. But here's the thing, every one of those super El Niños happened on a cooler planet than the one we're living on right now. The Earth today is approximately 1.3 degrees Celsius warmer than it was before industrialization. The last 12 months have been the warmest 12-month period ever recorded in human history. The oceans, which absorb over 90% of the excess heat that climate change traps, are warmer than they've been in the modern record. So, when El Niño releases that stored ocean heat back into the atmosphere, as it always does, it isn't starting from the same place previous events started from. It's starting from a higher floor. Think about it like a fever on top of a fever. The body was already running hot, and now something is about to push it higher. That's what makes 2026 different. Not just the strength of the El Niño itself, but the world is arriving into. This is the part that actually matters for most people watching this, because a super El Niño doesn't feel the same everywhere. Depending on where you live, it either brings too much water or not nearly enough, and understanding which side of that you're on is the key. Start with Asia. For India, Indonesia, the Philippines, and parts of Australia, a super El Niño typically means one thing: drought. The monsoon weakens. The rain that billions of people depend on for their crops and their water supply arrive late or don't arrive at all. The 2015 to 2016 Super El Niño contributed to one of India's worst agricultural droughts in decades. If 2026 matches or exceeds that intensity, the same regions face the same risk, except with larger populations and food systems already under stress from years of extreme weather. East Africa gets the opposite. Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia. These regions typically see above average rainfall during El Niño, which sounds like good news until you see what that actually looks like on the ground. The 2023 to 2024 El Niño, which wasn't even a super event, caused devastating floods across the region that displaced hundreds of thousands of people. In South America, the Amazon basin faces drought and heat, dangerous in a rainforest that is already under enormous pressure from deforestation. Around 40% of the Amazon is already affected by some form of forest degradation. A strong El Niño on top of that raises wildfire risk to levels that could rival the catastrophic 2019 and 2023 fire seasons. Meanwhile, Argentina, Uruguay, and southern Brazil tend to see the opposite: wetter conditions, above average rainfall, increased flooding risk in low-lying areas. For North America, the effects depend heavily on where you are. The southern United States typically sees wetter, milder winters. The Pacific Northwest faces reduced snowpack and expanded wildfire seasons come summer. The Midwest generally gets a warmer than average winter, by around 3 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. And across Europe, the latest forecast is already showing above normal temperatures, expected across nearly the entire continent throughout the summer months, with the strongest signal over southern Europe and the Mediterranean. Here's something that surprises most people when they first hear it. A super El Niño actually makes the Atlantic hurricane season quieter. Not safer everywhere, but quieter in the Atlantic. And understanding why reveals something genuinely interesting about how connected the world's weather systems really are. Connected and almost never reported that way. And that's actually the deeper problem with how most of us read the news today. Each of us only sees a narrow slice of reality, shaped by the outlets we follow and the region we live in. The bias itself is one thing. The harder problem is that we almost never know what we're not being shown. That's why I use Ground News. It's a platform that cuts through bias and hype by showing you how different outlets are covering the same story, political slant, headline framing, and what stories your feed might be missing entirely. For example, when the first images from the Artemis II mission were released, I used Ground News to ensure I was reading balanced, credible coverage. I could instantly see the bias distribution was nearly equal and check each outlet's factuality rating, verified by 3 independent organizations. And here's a cool detail. The founder is a former NASA engineer, so science coverage is taken seriously. My favorite feature is the blind spot, which flags stories being disproportionately covered by one side. If you're only interested in topics like science, The interest pages filter out the noise and show you only what matters to you. There's a special offer for viewers of this channel. For a limited time, you can subscribe and get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan by scanning this QR code on screen or heading to ground.news/SOU. The link is also in the description. Now, back to the Atlantic. Why does that happen? Why does a heating Pacific calm down hurricanes thousands of miles away? It comes down to one thing: wind shear. When the Pacific Ocean heats up dramatically, it changes the wind patterns high up in the atmosphere, over the Atlantic and the Caribbean. Those winds create what meteorologists call wind shear. Essentially, powerful gusts at high altitude that tear developing hurricanes apart before they can grow into something serious. Hurricanes need calm, consistent conditions to strengthen. Wind shear is their enemy, and a strong El Niño fills the Atlantic with it. NOAA and AccuWeather are already forecasting a below-average Atlantic hurricane season for 2026 because of this. For communities along the Gulf Coast and in the Caribbean that have lived through devastating seasons in recent years, that is genuinely good news. But here's the catch. The Pacific gets the opposite. El Niño warms the eastern Pacific, reduces wind shear there, and creates ideal conditions for storms to develop and strengthen off the coast of Mexico and Central America. AccuWeather is projecting 17 to 22 named storms in the eastern Pacific this season, with up to 8 potentially reaching major hurricane status. So while one ocean calms down, the other heats up. The Atlantic quietens, the Pacific intensifies. And whether that trade-off works in your favor depends entirely on which coastline you call home. Beyond the floods and droughts and hurricanes, there's a bigger number that climate scientists are watching very carefully: the global average temperature. Because a super El Niño doesn't just disrupt regional weather, it pushes the thermometer up for the entire planet. And where that thermometer ends up over the next 2 years could be genuinely historic. The pattern is reliable and well understood. El Niño releases heat that the ocean has been storing for years back into the atmosphere. That process consistently pushes global temperatures upward. The only difference is the starting point or the baseline. The planet is already warmer than it's ever been in the modern record. So when El Niño adds its heat on top of that, the numbers go somewhere new. Carbon Brief currently projects 2026 to be the second warmest year on record. But if the 3-degree ocean anomaly the models are projecting fully materializes, scientists are warning that 2027, when the full atmospheric impact of peak ocean temperatures typically arrives, with a lag of several months, could break the global temperature record by a meaningful margin. James Hansen's team at Columbia University projects global temperatures could reach 1.7 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2027. That would briefly push us above the 1.5 degree threshold that the Paris Agreement was designed to prevent. One important thing to understand here: a single year above 1.5 degrees is not the same as permanently crossing that threshold. Temperatures typically come back down when El Niño fades and La Niña conditions follow. But it doesn't mean that in 2026 and 2027, more people in more places will experience what a warmer world actually feels like in their daily lives, not as a statistic, as weather. So where does all this leave us? Every major institution agrees that El Niño is coming, that it's heading towards strong or super strength, and that it's arriving on the warmest baseline in recorded history. What that means practically is straightforward. The regions most vulnerable to El Niño, South Asian farming communities, East African populations in flood-prone areas, Amazon ecosystems already under pressure, Pacific coastlines in the path of intensifying storms, have strong scientific reason to be preparing right now, rather than waiting for certainty that may only arrive once the event is already underway. Seasonal forecasting exists precisely to create that window of preparation. And right now, that window is open. This isn't about fear, it's about information. The planet has been through Super El Niños before and come out the other side. But the ones that caused the least damage were the ones where communities, governments, and farmers knew what was coming and had time to act. The forecasts this week are giving us that time. The question is, what do we do with it?